Folks, welcome. Thank you for joining us as we kick off 2024's webinar series with our topic today, Restorative Justice in the South. My name is Avery Arrington. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm an assistant director at the National Center on Restorative Justice. Special thanks to our federal funding partners at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, that is a part of the U.S. Office of Justice Programs, our host institution, Vermont Law and Graduate School, and our additional grant partners at the University of San Diego and the University of Vermont, as we're all committed to improving policy and practice within the criminal legal system through restorative justice research, public education, and higher education. Today's conversation is a part of a larger series highlighting restorative justice work in different geographic regions across the United States. So folks will hear from various restorative justice practitioners, researchers, community-based organizations and organizers, system actors on different implementation models. As I said before, I'm super excited, super grateful we get to start with the South today. But feel free to visit ncorj.org to find out when the other regional webinars are happening and to learn about some other interesting topics that are relevant to restorative justice that we'll be covering this year. I'll now turn things over to our moderator today, DeMointe Wesley, who is a student of restorative justice, conflict transformation, and liberatory politics. Also my good friend and my good colleague from Texas, who I believe is a perfect fit for the Southern context today. So I'll turn it over to you, DeMointe, and thank you to you and all the other panelists today.
Thank you so much, Avery, and thank you everyone for being here. As Avery said, I am DeMointe Wesley, pronouns they, them, theirs. I hail from the often great state of Texas, and I am one of the assistant directors at the National Center along with Avery. We're so excited for this conversation with these awesome practitioners to tell you a little bit more about their work and how they're working to expand restorative justice in the South. So my friends, my esteemed panelists, are we ready? Ready to go? Fabulous. Okay, so I'm going to allow each panelist to sort of introduce themselves, a little bit about their work. And then I have this question for you around why investment in the South is so important. One of our panelists, Jazz, offered to us during one of our planning meetings this notion of don't give up on the South, which has been a really important rallying cry for folks working in reproductive justice spaces. So in your estimation, why is it so important to invest in the South as it relates to restorative justice? Why have you chosen to stay in the South? Or if you're not from the South, why have you chosen to come to the South and invest in this work? And so I'm going to kind of go in the order that I see on my screen. So I'm going to start off with you, Dan, and then pass to Jay, and then we'll sort of go in a circle from there.
Okay, thanks, DeMointe. Thanks, Avery, too. It's great to be with you all. Dan Kahn, I'm a co-executive director of the Florida Restorative Justice Association. We support the field of restorative practices throughout the state. I'm also a volunteer with the Community Connections Restorative Justice Program here in Tallahassee. And regarding my thoughts about being in the South, one of the main motivators in my life has been leverage. I want my actions to efficiently leverage my available energy and my abundant privilege to help create more equitable, sustainable, enjoyable, safe, and harmonious life on Earth. Sound good? That's the plan. You may have heard that when a bone in the body breaks, the site of that former fracture may become the strongest part of the limb. While the history of this continent in general is rife with damage and injustice, the South is the place where one set of humans explicitly dehumanized, used, and ravaged another set of humans for more than 3 centuries. As resilient as we may be, all of us to some degree live in the shadow of this history. While there is great and necessary work to be done everywhere, one promise of restorative and transformative practices in the South is that to the extent we can hear each other, heal, and collaborate in this region, which was the epicenter of so much of our collective trauma, the reverberations of that progress throughout the body of our shared humanity may continue to offer hope and a more solid foundation for the shared health and well-being we know is possible. I was born in Florida, grew up in New York, and lived all over before returning. It was here I discovered a nationwide advocacy campaign for peace-building practices, including restorative justice. I moved from Florida to Washington, D.C. to advance this campaign as National Field Director for the Peace Alliance. And during that time, I had the privilege of working with several different RJ associations in other states. And I came back to work in Florida because I was passionate about restorative practices, and I sensed there was much less of it going on in Florida than in some of those other places I had lived and collaborated with. But the programs I was aware of here were, to my mind, some of the most exciting and promising in the country. Plus, I was strongly connected with some of the people doing the work. So I came back for the community I knew was available for me, the positive impact I suspected I could have helping this movement to grow, and also the learning and personal development I saw available to me through working in this field. Bob Marley said, "Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war." He also said, "We don't need no more trouble. What we need is love, sweet love." And finally, maybe most famously, he said, "Don't worry about a thing, because every little thing is going to be all right." My life has been somewhat characterized by an effort to reconcile these themes.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for bringing Marley in. Jay, I pass it to you, and then I'm coming to you, LaShonda.
Oh, so glad to be in this space. And thank you, Dan, for giving us that full understanding. I came to the South from Northern California because I needed to be warmer than I was in Northern California, and I like the tropical living. But then being here in the South and learning about the context of all of the tensions that occur, um, learning about also the history, right? Because coming from what we consider progressive in Northern California, to a completely different culture, and different tensions was transformative to me in and of itself. And then I found myself in the school system, working with young people and being able to offer restorative practice to them and seeing how they were able to play with it and transform as they were learning the content that they were learning in school, and which is different than the content that you learn in Northern California or New York when I was a young person being born, and really grappling with the history of Black labor in the South, um, the demand for land and justice, complete equality, um, against really the struggles of oppression in the United States, uh, which is very prevalent and real, because we are working against like this lost cause ideology that's really like spurring itself up again. And what I find is that restorative justice offers a wonderful tool to help balance power, to allow people to have storytelling and truth telling of the impacts of what's going on in the history and the culture of what's going on in the South. And, but the way of the South is really the way of the US and the way that we work. What comes out of the South really has an impact across the US and really across nations. And so we have to be here and working and holding that so that there is less over criminalization of Black and brown bodies into really a slave economy that still exists today, just differently than it was prevalent in the past. And by doing that, we will be able to be the impetus for transformation on a national level. That's why I'm here.
Thank you, Jay. Coming to you, LaShonda, and the next will be Kelly.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again, DeMonte and the National Center, for having, one, this conversation, and two, for allowing me to be in this space. And I think this is kind of odd because, Dan, I'm the opposite. Well, maybe not the opposite. I was born in Miami, Florida, and my mom moved me and my siblings to New York City. And so I had lived in New York City for over 20 years. And then due to gentrification, I came to Virginia. And so for me, the South plays a very, it's like an essential part of a lot of things, because what I learned when I came to the South, well, to Virginia, um, is really how deep oppression is and how it funnels its way throughout our states, right? Like being a young person living in New York City, a lot of things that affect Black people in marginalized communities was not as known to me until I came to the South, where it was like in my face, very prevalent. And so I am a social worker by profession, a criminal justice advocate. And a lot of my criminal justice advocacy stems because I was a child part of the criminal justice system. My father was murdered in Florida, and I was part of the criminal justice system very young. And then living between Florida and New York City and low income housing, and just being a part of all of the systemic oppression that is put on low and marginalized communities. I've lived it, I've experienced it. And so when I came to Virginia and got the opportunity to get an education in social work, I focused primarily on criminal justice reform, because what I realized when I came to Virginia was that was one of my barriers, right? Is having a spouse that has criminal justice involvement, and you being that direct person, you are living as a person with criminal justice involvement as well. And so I remember a saying that I heard at a webinar, and it was stated that if you are not at the table, then you're on the chopping block. And so one of the things that I feel is that restorative justice allows me to be in spaces where those voices are not heard, and I can stop those individuals or those communities from being on the chopping block and speak power to voices and say, I am a person, see me, I understand what is going on, and this is why restorative justice is so important. And so I would like to thank Kelly Burnett, who's on the call too, is that the city, Richmond City, did an amazing thing of bringing restorative justice really to the forefront within our criminal justice system. And so it is a privilege to be able to use restorative justice within a higher ed, because I'm also a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. So using restorative practices with my students, but also being able to use that within my space as a case manager doing restorative justice with individuals returning from incarceration. And so that is really my why. I don't think I was, I think I was more divine for this space than I chose this space.
Thank you so much, LaShonda. Coming to you, Kelly, and then Jasmine, to you next.
Thank you, Demointe, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you, LaShonda. And I'm so honored to be here with so many practitioners in the field. I am a prosecutor in Richmond, Virginia. I have been a prosecutor here for almost 20 years. Most of that time I spent in the juvenile and family court. And I am from the South. I'm originally from Tennessee. But I have now lived in Richmond, Virginia longer than anywhere else, and it is my home. And I want to participate in restorative justice and advance restorative justice here because it is my home and because I love the people who are here and I care about the people who are here. And I have learned mostly through my experience in the juvenile system, the harm that has been done historically, but also the harm that has been and can be caused by the criminal justice system. I have had to grapple with the harm that I have caused on occasions, and knowing that there are better ways to address behaviors and address issues in our community that results in justice system involvement has really motivated me to try to explore everything I can regarding restorative practice. And that led to meeting LaShonda a couple of years ago. So she and I work closely together on a community program called Richmond Restorative Justice. That is now a nonprofit agency, and she is the president of that. And that organization uses volunteers to do community building circles, and we support that agency financially and also with organizational labor for training and to go out into the community, promote healing, to conduct dialogue circles, and really bring awareness to restorative practices in Richmond. And then we also, in my office, utilize another community-based organization to provide conferencing for cases that we refer that have already come to court for conferencing, victim offender conferencing, and we resolve them usually with a dismissal. So we are promoting that and doing that as much as we can, and I'm happy to be part of the work.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Jazz, coming to you, and then last but not least, Aparna.
Thank you all, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Story. My pronouns are they, them, and everyone calls me Jazz. I'm coming to you from Muskogee territory. I steward 15 acres of land with community members in Alabama. The farm, Freedom Farm Azul, is centered around two experiences of violent transition in the state. One, the experiences of our formerly incarcerated and actively incarcerated siblings, and those of our siblings that are LGBTQIA+. And so we operate as both a healing space, an educational space, and a place for nourishment. So the food that we grow, we give out for free to the community. Our team is all justice impacted, and for us that means you have either been incarcerated yourself or a close family member, parent, sibling has been incarcerated. And so our team has a similar dedication to the community, and that's something that really bonds us. To answer the question about like why is it so important to not give up on the South, and I just want to give a beautiful shout out to the Yellowhammer Fund who brought those words to my tongue, and I'm so grateful for it. The first thing I want to think about is the state of the space. Now, I'm in Alabama. I grew up between Alabama and Georgia. I also lived all over the world, came back to serve as the first deputy director of the first Office of Social Justice in Alabama. And if anybody knows me, I don't do well with constriction. And so my next move was to really center in the tradition of transformative justice, something that lived outside of everything else. And the farm is very much that outside of everything else. But why was that necessary and needed? For those who do not know, Alabama's prisons have the highest rate of suicide, of murder and violence. The report, an investigation that came from the Department of Justice about Alabama's correctional facilities is so harrowing that when I was still serving in the mayor's office, I could only read 3 pages a day without getting physically ill. So when I think about everyone who surrounds me in my community who has survived these state prisons, I only have a deepened dedication to this work. I am horrified at the reality of the carceral experience in Alabama. And I'm deeply honored to be in a place where we can build a space for formerly incarcerated folk to bring their children, their grandchildren, to run around and play in the mud and listen to music and eat good food, because peace and ease is not something that has ever been granted to the folks of Alabama, period. It's the start and the end of the sentence. It's the start and the end of the history as we are in present. But what is so powerful about being in this space is all of our heroes built in Alabama first. When I think about the need for movement to restructure itself, why invest in Alabama, all of your heroes understood that this place was the place, the true crux, where mobilization and activation not only would be possible, But to do it in one of the hardest, most violent places would show everyone else in the world that it could be done where they are. And that being a crucial part of why you have to invest in the South, why I didn't leave Alabama and go back to New York, why I'm still here almost 5 years later. It's because all of my heroes came from here. All of your heroes came from here, from the use of the Black Panther coming out of Lowndes County to all of the movement knowledge that comes out of Montgomery and Birmingham. Your heroes came here for a reason, and I'm here to stay for that same reason. This is where the work has to be done. I am beyond convinced of it. And just to end and pass it, I think about a quote from Ani DeFranco. They say, "You left me with nothing, but I've worked with less." Alabama activists know how to work with less, and we do, and we get it done. And we do it because we have no choice. And now, unfortunately, I'm going to quote Adam Sandler from the movie Hustle, and I'm going to say, they can't kill you if you're already dead. So much of the reality of the South is to bring children into a world where life is not guaranteed to them. And so the crucialness of this work cannot be captured even in our words. It's something that you truly have to come down here and feel. And with that, I pass it.
Thank you, Jazz. Aparna, passing to you.
Thank you. Jazz, this is not the first time I have spoken after you, and I was like, ooh, there's a lot of pressure because you just put everything so beautifully. So thank you for that. My name is Aparna Polavarapu. I am a law professor at the University of South Carolina Rice School of Law, and I'm also the founder and executive director of the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative. So I don't know, I wear a bunch of hats, I guess. I do the usual professorial stuff. I write, I teach, I think about this, theoretically and also in terms of impacts, but also I'm a practitioner and I facilitate workshops and I'm a circle keeper and I want to build out skills and I'm in community. And that's all in South Carolina. I am not originally from South Carolina. I'm a Northerner who moved south. I was born and raised in New York. It's a very different environment. I've lived here almost 12 years now. I want to say 11 and a half. And the question was, why the South, right? Or why invest in the South? Well, what I can say specifically about South Carolina is, when I moved here, I didn't know what I was going to get into. I definitely had some preconceptions, but I really allowed myself to see what this place was all about, see what the community was all about, see what the people were all about. And my impression was that this is a state that's often looked over. I feel like unless people want to complain about like 2 or 3 people or laud them, I don't know. Otherwise you forget about South Carolina. And that's really unfortunate to me. Because during my time here, I have just met, I've met people who just work. We're like, we need to like create a better world. We are boots on the ground. And yeah, it's grit and it's relentless, but we're doing it. And again, largely ignored by the rest of the country. To the extent that we are seeing national efforts, I feel like sometimes it's tough because it's helpful, but we also have to remind them you can't come from somewhere else and just assume you know what to do here, right? And maybe that's another reason why the South, because you can't build in another place and then just say, listen, I'm not going to bother to know you or how you are or understand you. I'm just going to like expect you to transplant what I got over here. That doesn't work. We're our own people. Like the communities, some of these communities here are so deep rooted. And there are people who've been working hard, they're generations, right? They're leaders, like decade after decade that are doing the work. And that's like, they're a powerful group to be connected with. And there's real belief and desire to just make change happen. So for me, that's partly why. I'll also say that in terms of restorative justice specifically, there are a number of communities here that are deeply relational. Relationality is so, so important here. And I think that's why, you know, I think re-empowering communities really does involve like bringing this work back to communities. And I don't know, I just think that we would see widespread change and empowerment and uplifting if we can just take the time to do that well here in the South. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Aparna, and thank you, each of you, for that really full, like I feel like we've covered so much ground in just our first question. So thank you for that. And I just want to remind or maybe let the folks who are attending know, feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions that you have. You don't have to hold those questions to the end. We may not get to them until the end, but ask them as you have them. And folks may also respond to your question in chat. So as you have questions, feel free to drop those. So the next question that I want us to sort of tackle together kind of speaks to that point that you just made, Aparna, about the sort of uniqueness of the South. Really, all of you spoke to this really beautifully. But I guess the question is, how does the South sort of color or inform restorative justice and restorative justice practice and service provision, and justice in general? Again, some of you have sort of spoken to that. And then to sort of add a layer to that question, how are you all in your context sort of getting strategic about what it means to do the work of restorative justice in the South, you know, given the political climate, given the perhaps limited language or limited access to language around restorative justice? And to my folks, we sort of have an order there, but again, I'll sort of open it up to you to sort of jump in on that question.
I mean, I ended on communities, so I can keep talking there because that was really how I talk about it. So just picking up on your last, sort of the second question you asked about how we talk about restorative justice in the South. So my own approach to talking about restorative justice here in South Carolina really just reflects my philosophy of restorative justice. And sort of generally speaking, that is that restorative justice cannot be understood solely within the context of the criminal system. I think that's just far too restrictive. I guess as a note, my background is in human rights. I came to the restorative justice space by working with and looking at informal and community-based systems of justice in other countries. And so for me, this is very much about dignity and promoting rights generally. But I think, we have an instinct to sort of talk about restorative justice in terms of the criminal system. Again, I said, I find that too restrictive. I think it's restorative justice is like its own creature that can connect with the criminal system or offer alternatives to criminal processes, but it can also completely avoid it or have nothing to do with it. And so in terms of languaging, I'm talking, when I'm talking about the justice aspect, I'm in that group of practitioners that thinks about restorative justice in terms of harm rather than crime. And I think about restorative justice as a practice that responds to harm. And I also talk about the broader set of restorative practices that do not require our harm to have occurred, right? And these are available, either of these are available to communities completely outside systems, completely outside the legal system or other state systems. And I'm very intentional about talking about RJ in this way. I think of restorative justice as a broad practice that can take referrals from the state or avoid the state altogether. And this is because I believe that communities need to be empowered to engage in these practices. People need to have a way to address harms without having to wait for the state to get involved, without involving the state if they don't want to, or to address harms that the state just doesn't address, right? And again, I speak this way because it like reflects my philosophy, but I also think there's this additional benefit in that this conceptualization of restorative justice supports the sustainability and integrity of the practice, right? So I work with people who do work with the state or in state systems, and I also work with community members. I also work with nonprofit organizations, grassroots orgs, other community-facing groups. And because I can sort of like, I have this expansive view of RJ and also of talking about it and sharing about it that way, I think it supports this like larger distribution of the work. And the more that this work, the more that this practice is distributed across the population, then the less we are reliant on one practice or one institution remaining true to the integrity of restorative justice, or even just simply like continuing to exist, right? I having this sort of come out this way, I think, really like allows for more expansive understandings and also allows me, I mean, speaking about strategy, to operate a bit more nimbly because I don't necessarily need to operate within state structures. You know, when I'm from the beginning saying like here we are in community.
Yeah, thank you for that. I see LaShonda's hand, and then I wanted to come to you next, Kelly, to sort of maybe offer the other side of that perspective.
So just really quickly, I just wanted to share from a community standpoint and living in Virginia, right? I think that needs to be brought into the space of what Virginia is, right? Virginia is the state that it all started, right? And so understanding the oppression and the generational oppression that happens or that is still prominent in Virginia. And I think the reason why restorative justice is so needed here is because RJ allows for those conversations to be had. Even when we're talking about in-school discipline, a lot of cases or a lot of challenges that we see is based off of discipline. But when we look at the historical context of good behavior and bad behavior, we cannot not think about the historical context of how individuals are viewed in the state of Virginia. And so when we talk about how the criminality and the behavior can be definitely tied together and intersected, I look at Virginia just as that, right? Looking at the historical context in the criminal justice system and how in Virginia, you know, as young as third grade, we're looking at just the testing of a student, whether we should build a prison or if this person is going into higher education. That's historical, that's systemic, right? And so understanding Virginia is that foundation and being in this space to be able to allow communities like Aparna said and take back their power to say, we want this for ourselves. How can you help us facilitate this? Or how can you help us get the resources to bring into our community so that we can take back control of our communities, take back control of our schools of education? And I'm with Aparna, like education is huge, educating communities on what their rights are. A lot of our communities have no idea what their rights are, what do they actually have the ability to do in certain spaces. And so I believe for Virginia, restorative justice, and I just want to differentiate the difference between restorative justice and restorative practices, because I think sometimes that gets confused in understanding that the practices is something we can do all the time, but when we speak criminal justice, we should keep that within the criminal justice setting, but using the context of criminal restorative practices when we are talking about other things. And so I just wanted to bring that into the space as well.
Thank you. Yeah, Kelly.
I really agree with Aparna and LaShonda about the availability of restorative justice outside of the criminal justice system. And when we started a couple of years ago, kind of designing how we wanted to approach making this accessible to people in our community, we made an intentional decision not to try to create a restorative justice provider inside the prosecutor's office or inside the court, for several reasons. Most of those have already been stated, but primarily the solution and the service to the community needs to come from the community. There is a lot of distrust of government, of law enforcement. A lot of that is well founded in historical context and pseudo history. And we don't have all of the solutions, and we need to let the people who have the skills to keep circles and facilitate and have credibility with the people they're sitting circle with, to do that work, and not try to overtake that. And also because government power changes with elections, it doesn't need to be tied to that. It shouldn't be political. It's something that it benefits, everyone involved. It should not be tied to elections, and we wanted something that is sustainable and community-based. And so we made intentional decisions when we were seeking funding about using that funding in that way, and developing a program that would sustain beyond, my elected boss. So I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. And, to pick up on that last point of like not relying necessarily on elected officials, that is certainly true. And I think there can be a lot of power in engaging with elected officials. And I wonder if Jay or Dan can maybe speak to that experience.
I can offer some thought processes. First, I wanted to go back to that first question, and I appreciate, LaShonda, the distinction between restorative practice and restorative justice, because restorative practice for me, and if we're talking about how we talk about it in the South in the context of Florida, it really is a way of life that you can be in, right? With the practice, you could just be in this way of life of engaging all aspects of relationship building, because it's a tool to help build relationship, to balance power, and to allow for truthful storytelling to happen so that you can get to real accountability for that, right? And so in the context of a place, in the context of the South, in the context of the history of the level of oppression that exists, and needing to like kind of get to the core of that, so that then you can be able to identify what the solutions are that continue to create pathways into the criminal legal system when we're talking about trying to achieve restorative justice, and creating accessibility to that. And one of the things that we've been doing in Florida, and I am going to shift it over to Dan because he was in the action of it, and I'll tell you why. And we're talking about coloring, restorative justice, and being in Florida and having an administration, legislators that are that come from real deep-rooted Southern ideology that we all know we're talking about. You have to be able to build those relationships that we're talking about in the practice with people that they can receive the knowledge from, right? Without just like just giving us the pushback. And so one of the things that we saw evolve within our organization as we're trying to make sure that we are expanding existing legislation. Like, so there's RJ legislation that exists. It's not being funded. We'll talk about that later with one of the questions if we get to it. But using the language that already exists there and expanding it to create more accessibility for the people who will benefit from the practice within their institution. So we're holding the practice, but we have to now in particular use the language of the institution that's going to be accessible, right? And there's different ways to be able to talk about it within the context of the justice part of it. And knowing that there's elements of different things that happen, mediation, blah, 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 that have the practice rooted in it that helps us get to creating that accessibility to more restorative justice. So I can say that within FRJA, Florida Restorative Justice Association, we have a committee of folks that came together, whether openly articulated or not, but were white identified folks talking to white identified legislators so that they could then offer educational awareness and advocacy for more restorative justice so that we can then get the legislation that we were asking for. Didn't happen because zero tolerance and punitive measures is the play of the day right now in Florida, and folks are really trying to pull into this lost cause ideology that we know exists. But there was a lot of headway that happened, and Dan can speak to that because Dan was on that team in those offices.
Sure. Thanks, Jay. Yeah, so we got into a lot of doors. You know, we got in to speak with, I was astounded at how many actual legislators we got to talk with. I have never been in a legislative session where I talked with so many actual legislators. And I think part of that was because we were lobbying with a couple of people who have some, like, who are white identified and have some conservative credentials, and one of whom has really strong credentials with an experience with victim services, who has brought awareness of restorative practices into the victim services office. So we were talking in very victim-centered terms. We were talking about victims' rights to things like asking the kind of questions which can only come up in restorative conferences. And we had really very little pushback for a while. We talked with members of the relevant committees. It was pretty dreamy. Like I said, I've done some federal advocacy, and to speak with so many legislators who say, yeah, I'll support that. Yeah, that sounds good. You know, let me know what else I can do. We had several Republican co-sponsors in the House and the Senate. It had some momentum. The sponsor of our bill heard it come down from the Speaker of the House that they would not bring it to a vote, that even if it made it through that committee, it was not going to come to a vote. So we had to decide if we were going to bring it through the committee just to have it talked about more and then have it shot down, or just sort of retreat at that point and regroup for next session. So like Jay said, it's a lot of awareness raising. We got to have a lot of conversations where we said, you know, to people with substantial power, hey, here's this thing which you might not be aware of, here's how it works. And to share stories, share anecdotes from our own experiences and from people we've worked with. And so that's you know, one form of progress, but it's also a fair amount of energy, you know, to organize a committee and go to the Capitol, you know, over and over and make the phone calls, do the emails. If there's passion for it, if there's time for it, but on balance with how much are we not doing during that time of, like other folks have said, going directly to the communities and how do we facilitate program building, resource building, access. So there are trade-offs. Some of our hopes were that by getting more enshrined in legislation, that could open the door for more funding on local levels. We were looking at two different avenues. One was to create an obligation on the part of prosecuting offices to alert victims of crimes when restorative justice, I'm sorry, I'm using shorthand, people directly impacted by criminal matters, to make sure they are aware of restorative justice when it's available in the district. So it would just go on the information card in that district. So that would have gone on the front end, more or less. And then within the Department of Corrections, to add restorative practices to the list of things that are sort of acceptable programs for incarcerated people to engage in. If it were officially on that list, some folks are doing that already, are going into facilities and doing education and conferencing, et cetera. But if it were on that list, then it might open some doors to funding. And that was our strategy, a little bit of an opening of doors. So yeah, some strange bedfellows and some interesting conversations.
Also having the definition of restorative justice outlined so that there's no ambiguity about the way that we are talking about the work and the practice. So that was critical. So
yeah, thanks.
I think can I just piggyback off that real quick? To your point about defining, one thing that I came back to, I recently just filled out an application about privilege. And it was, one of the questions was like, were you raised in a Christian household? And I was just like, you know, despite how I identify right now, that is a privilege in a Christian dominant space. And so what was really important, and I quickly picked up on, is that restorative has its own meaning within particular Protestant Southern practices of Christianity. And so while I was still in the mayor's office and I was talking to people, I was realizing that they're hearing these words and they're assuming they know what it means. They're hearing restorative, they're hearing justice, because these words do belong particularly in a Black theology around that is tied around Christianity. And so that's something that I also just wanted to name, that while folks are coming down here, you need to ask people what is their understanding of these words before you start the conversation, almost kind of like going on a date and like, let me just go ahead and figure out if you're the youngest of four, because I only date older siblings, right? So it's like, let me go ahead and see what you understand and then provide you with my understanding. And again, naming it as that, how they understand and my understanding, not that there is one, because that's one thing that Southerners don't like, is to be told what to do.
Yeah, very appreciative of Jay and Dan for that context, and for Jazz for that addition as well. Especially considering that a lot of the work in the South, or I'll speak in the Texas context, a lot of the work is held, restorative justice work is held by religious institutions, Christian institutions, or organizations. So getting really clear on that language, I think, is very important. All right. So we've spoken again to our next question. We've spoken a lot to this around like, how have you each contributed to building RJ in your areas? But I think something that might be of a lot of interest to people who are, again, in the South thinking about how to do this work is how you all have gone about funding this work. How have you gone about getting the resources needed to expand restorative justice in your context? So where that has happened, where that has been possible to get some funding, how did that happen? And yeah, if maybe you could speak to that a little bit. Maybe Kelly, if you want to start us off. Yeah.
Sure, I can share. So when I left the juvenile court position that I was in, my official title was the insurance fraud prosecutor, because we did not have a position at that time related to community justice. And so for a while, I did two jobs, developing our community justice reform unit, which is the position that I now officially hold, and doing insurance fraud. So sometimes you have to take what's available and then try to make what you're wishing for. So we started with a grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And because we're a government agency and a prosecutor's office, we were eligible for a burn public safety grant. And we wrote that to fund essentially two projects, one being the community-based organization that LaShonda now oversees, and she was our grant coordinator. And then the other was funding to refer cases that had already come to us from law enforcement on to restorative justice for resolution. We then had a forum where we showcased the results of that. We were able to refer about 20 cases, and 18 of them were successfully resolved. Every case that went to conference was successfully resolved. There were a few that did not, a couple where people changed their minds, which is going to happen, but we felt like it was very successful overall. And then we also, at that forum, we showcased the work that LaShonda and the other volunteers were doing in the community, and all the different organizations that interacted with that program. So all of those people who are volunteering to be circle keepers were already community involved, and many working on their own nonprofits. And so we really just displayed the impact of that. And then that next budget cycle, we asked for money from the city to continue the work. And so that is how my position was funded. And then we continue to fund the restorative justice work that we're doing today.
Yeah, Jazz, I saw you.
I'm really lucky that the farm has been supported by community giving circles. So that's really where we have received funding, are from folks like us who care, who put their money together in pots and distributed it. That is also really important for our own autonomy, sovereignty, and freedom, which I'm really grateful for. That plus private, personal, family foundations allows us to answer to no one but us, that is the community. And that being a really powerful check and balance for us, not the people who write the checks, but instead the people who receive services, provide services, and also to really be wary of even applying for community foundation grants within our area, given the fact that if at any point, especially being a queer-run organization that centers and takes care of queer people, at any point we could get negative press, which would actually increase the likelihood of threat to violence to us. So for me, I am deeply grateful for the relationships outside of the South that have provided us with funding, either personal foundations or giving circles, because there's not going to be a COP grant that I'm going to apply for. There's not going to be a community fund grant, a DOJ grant that I'm going to apply for. It's just not going to happen, because our people have to stay safe. And a part of that safety is keeping this project moderately small.
Yeah, thank you for that as well, Jazz. Thinking about like funding from sources often comes with, obligations to those funding sources, and how does that limit, but also maybe expand the work, or expand the opportunity to do the work. I'm wondering if others of you could maybe speak to that idea of like, if funding, how you have gotten funding, but if funding from government sources or other things like that is limited, how have you gone about doing the work in a way that is still really meaningful?
I mean, I think I'm similar. I think Jazz and I probably get like similar types of funding. A lot of what has sustained me, and in the beginning it was real shoestring, y'all. But it was, it's giving circles, and some of them from out of state, also having a lot of support from like a larger practitioner network. Community facing grants, orgs that are really, really intentionally focused on supporting supporting groups, smaller organizations that are really sitting in community. So that's been helpful, but that also means it's not like a ton of money. And sometimes it's also been just about collaboration. So relationships with other groups and pulling together to develop, sort of whatever we want to develop. I will say that like the arc of my work sort of starts with several groups at like education and then skills building. And then for depending on who I'm working with, it might turn into like, okay, let's brainstorm what we would build. And so like I'm in that space now of creation with a few different groups. And at least one of them, you know, it may turn into applying for a federal grant because of the space that they're in. Right. And so a lot of it really depends for me on who I'm working with, what do folks need. But there are absolutely communities where it's just like that's not even on the table. And honestly, you know, for me, it's even questionable because there are a lot of strings, right? And so that's not going to work for everybody I work with. So I always need to make sure I've got access to community and community funds, et cetera. Yeah, and sometimes it is, you know, just to go to your point about when it's hard and when there's not a lot on how to make it work. I don't know. I'm just thinking of one thing. I think a lot of it is collaboration with community groups and developing in the ways that we can using what we have. So a lot of, you know, what I talked about before in terms of having this really broad approach and empowering communities, this requires a lot of people, right? It requires like big imagination to create in these ways. And one of the things that I've been working on with other like-minded folks and is finding ways to really engage in that, right? So I'm working with a group that is right now thinking through like how might we build out a practice that works specifically to support people who've experienced partner violence or sexual harm, right? And so maybe that's going to be a federal grant that we apply for, right? But we're doing a lot of circling like every 2 weeks. How do we build? What does this look like? And we go through all of our foundational principles, right? And it just shout out to Mimi Kim and her toolkit, Creative Interventions, fantastic toolkit, really good starting point for us to work through. But then I'm also working with a theater professor, and we're engaging in radical imagination with these artists because I think the arts are really wonderful ways to like explore this work, right? So they don't just hold up a mirror, but they also help us imagine new worlds. And that is truly like collaborative. We're bringing the resources that we have together to try to make something possible. So I do think like sometimes it's hard and sometimes there's not a lot of money, but we can make it absolutely work. I don't know if I answered all of that, but.
No, definitely. Thank you for that. And a couple of things, and LaShonda, I see you, that I wanted to like double tap on were like this idea of collaboration. And then also what I'm hearing is like cross-regional solidarity. So although we're here to talk about the South, that notion of not giving up on the South is very much about like Southerners not giving up on the South, but it's also about those in other regions who, as all of you have spoken to beautifully, understand the importance of the South. It means them not giving up on the South as well and investing as they can in the work that's happening here. So just wanted to uplift that. LaShonda.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about the funding piece too. When the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office came and we had the conversation about doing something in this, the first thing I thought about was who in the community could I partner with, or who in the community is already doing similar work that will be great circle keepers, right? And so when we first went into this, we had individuals that, like Kelly said, already had 501c3 set up, that were like clinicians, because I believe my thought process for how we would utilize restorative practices in Richmond was it was going to be multi-pronged, right? Like you're going to have communities that are in need and needs healing. But when you start to heal these communities, other things come up, other needs become identified. And the one thing I have always been afraid of is walking away from a circle that I felt was not whole when I walked away from it, right? And so we intentionally partnered with individuals that may have had some funding that we could tap into if we needed any funding, besides what we already had, or that just had resources and knew how to connect folks to those resources that they need, and resources that were vetted, resources that the community themselves were used to utilizing, individuals they were used to seeing. I know sometimes we try to stick to, I want to see somebody that looks like me, but understand in Virginia, it's not always about color. A lot of the times it can be about class. And so it's your zip code, where you live, and different things like that, of how do you feel comfortable and what works best for you. So I think when we were talking about budgeting and things like that, to be able to be sustainable, we were looking at mostly collaboration and partners that we could piggyback with to be able to provide the support for the community.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Jay or Dan, I want to also get y'all in here. Any ideas or anything you want to offer on this notion of funding, how you make it work?
I can offer some support. There's in Florida, we were blessed with a very long history of being able to advance restorative justice, because initial funding came down from like the let me look at my notes right here, the 1996 Neighborhood Restorative Justice Act that was federal. And so from that, there was some universities that were partnered, and there were like 33 neighborhood accountability boards that did restorative justice, like until the funding started to dwindle away. And that happened over a series and number of years. So you weren't seeing the robustness of the practice or justice happening in communities in the same way. But out of that, there still are pockets of programming that were allowed to survive. So like, I think we have Duval County, Dan can help me with this. We have Broward County, and there's some places that were able to kind of transform that money and then use kind of local dollars to keep programming alive. And then there's also like the, nonprofit organizations that are doing the work, that have it like rooted in kind of the mission of how they're doing their programming. So we have that. And then as organizations like Florida Restorative Justice Association were erected, that is where you're allowing to continue to like kind of build a coalition. And I'll pass it to Dan to be able to tell more about that, because he was there at the beginning.
More or less, yeah, thanks. I think I was there, but before it started, then I was in DC when it actually got started. But as I kind of mentioned, I came back to Florida around 2016 for 2 jobs. One was a case manager in the Community Connections Restorative Justice Program in Tallahassee. The other was to be the executive director of FRJA. And Community Connections is sort of a hybrid RJ program, and it was transformed in the early 2000s into it being more of a restorative justice program than like accountability panel for youthful offenders kind of thing. So it got much more restorative, and Cindy Bigby took it over and really brought empathetic communication skills curriculum into it, and it became like a 3.5-month long program for teens to help them with goal setting and support them with whatever their passions are, and opportunities for accountability, which sometimes involved face-to-face with directly harmed people. So like I said, kind of a hybrid. That program still is a program of the city of Tallahassee. So the city provides space and infrastructure, meeting space, phones, computers, et cetera. And then supplemental funding comes from the Department of Juvenile Justice of the state of Florida. And that's enough to hire 3 case managers total. I left the staff about 2 years ago and became a volunteer. So I've been volunteering, and I continue to volunteer with the program. As far as FRJA, so it's the word shoestring has come up. FRJA has operated on a shoestring. And so when I became the director, there was hardly any money, but I had this other job as a case manager. I was the only employee for a while. And we just didn't need much money. We were virtual, we're spread out, we're not running programs. So FRJA is an association. We support the field. We do what we can electronically. We host a monthly Zoom call. Then we started having conferences, and conferences became our biggest revenue source. Our first conference, I think we netted $8,000 or $9,000. That was big money for us. And then 2 years later, we had another conference, and it was around 11,000, I think. So that's kind of enough to keep the lights on. And then membership. So membership, on a very loose sliding scale and by donation. So it's not big money. And then more recently, we have a private donor that has done substantial funding to help us to have 2 co-directors. So thank goodness Jay came along. Jay worked with me as a volunteer for about 2.5 years as we were developing our guidelines. We created with a long, very inclusive process of writing and co-editing some guidelines for training and practice. And through that process of working together closely, at some point I said, please, I need help. Can we hire Jay? And the board said, yeah. So that's been the last 2.5 years, something like that. We've been together a while. So that's a snapshot. It might give you some idea of where some money has flowed in our experiences.
And we're still looking at like those federal grants, and then also looking for funding partners that are aligned with the type of work, focusing on the South, building power in the South. And we haven't really tapped into those yet, but I do think a partner that we should have a conversation for my dreams of what's happening in the South, because it sounds like we might have applied for the same grant, which I'm very excited to hear about.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And on that point, Jay, of our dreams for the South, I actually want to turn to that question now, just so that we have as much time as possible to answer it as fully as needed. And then maybe get to, y'all kind of killed it in the Q&A. We only have 2 unanswered questions, so maybe we'll turn to those if we have time. But I want to give us time for each of us to answer this question of, what are you dreaming about in terms of what is possible for RJ in the South, in terms of building a movement, expanding this work that is really legitimate and really, unique to the South as well. So maybe we'll start. I'll let us go, and then maybe we'll pass it around. We'll see who's ready.
Because it really does just build right off of what I was talking about. So we have Florida Restorative Justice Association, and what we're finding on those monthly calls that Dan is speaking about is that a lot of people from other neighboring Southern states are joining that call to build relationship, to build kind of what I'm calling restorative power. And so it's made me have this dream of being able to shift to the Southern Restorative Justice Association, so that we are mobilizing a larger network of resources and power, so that then we can develop a strategy to move forward in the South, like together as a solid collective of people doing this work. I mean, from the state attorneys, from folks that are doing work in juvenile justice and in dependency care, like that are actually doing RJ. One of the wonderful models that happened before our new legislation came in is Florida Restorative Justice used to have a statewide advocacy group. So it was like all of the major agencies together having this conversation in institutions about how they can implement and expand restorative justice within the context of their institution. It has, now people are kind of like not being allowed to have this conversation in the same way or show up at those type of meetings. But being able to build that out, being able to build that out on a larger Southern context would, I think, be super powerful. And then also hearing that there might be opportunities where we're already connecting and just haven't had that cross section yet is very exciting. And that's what my open dream is.
Beautiful. And I'll say, for one, I would love to join a Southern association. Send me the links. Anybody
We have
else?
the flyest conferences. Our conferences be like on point. So
I love
anybody who hasn't come, you have been missing out, and you should be looking for us after NACRJ's conference.
Beautiful.
For me, for Virginia, what I really would like is to have a center. Like, I want a brick and mortar. I want a building where individuals can come and they can get training, they can get Circle keepers can, build on their skill sets. They can meet and interact with other individuals that facilitate in circles, maybe in a totally different context, right? Like one of the questions was talking about art. Like someone can be using art and using street art to talk to our young people and connect with our young people, and just looking at all the various ways we can do it. My just dream is to have this brick and mortar where people feel just welcome to walk into that space and say, I'm here. I heard you offer this service. I may not know anything about it, but I'm interested and I want to learn more. So that is like my all-time dream.
I guess my dream is to be completely replaceable. I mean, I would love you to all value me for like what I offer and my uniqueness, but I also want to not be needed. I mean, how wildly are you letting me dream, right? Like I want community power. I want people like just regaining their strength as communities, their connectedness, their ability to address harms as they arise without needing to like farm it out, right? To vision what they want to be together using these types of practices. I want to see, one thing I'll say is one difficulty of working in the South is like a real resistance to talking about certain things. This idea of like, when I first moved here, someone said it to me and it just really took me aback. Polite conversation. But only certain people really get to decide what polite conversation is. And I just like, let's get rid of that, right? Let's like create spaces of just belonging where we can really lean into truth telling. Because I don't know how we're going to move forward if we don't like at least acknowledge the past. Come on, So truth telling, empowerment, these types of just like connective practices spread across communities, and lots of people doing it so that we all have lots of options.
I can go next. I love everyone else's dreams. I'm getting inspired by all of them. I would love to help with the brick and mortar, LaShonda. Let's do that. Let's have a safe place where people can come and be connected to community. I sometimes train police officers on juvenile justice, or used to. And I would explain to them that really we haven't had juvenile court in the United States for very long. In Virginia, it's just been a little over 100 years. And I asked them, what did people do when juveniles committed crimes before that? It was handled in the community. We expected the community to provide support, and the churches and the schools and the families and the neighbors. And we have lost, I think, so much of that. And so I think we need that connectedness. I want to see that happening for the young people and for all people. And I would love to see more systemic like structure around restorative justice. Like Aparna was saying, being replaceable, not feeling like we are, moving this ball in every day, that there's something, that there are laws in place, that there are organizations in place, that the work is sustaining itself. And that there is a collective understanding about what restorative practice is, and that we're holding that up to a high standard.
I'll go next partly because I want to see Jazz go last. wanted to bat last and just knock in all all the runs. But yeah, I want to live in y'all's world. That all sounds great. Restorative practices everywhere, embraced by all institutions and robustly outside of institutions in unrecognizable systemic settings, and yeah, a hearty, robust truth and healing process specific to some of the harms that have taken place in the South. There are already great efforts underway doing that. I want to make sure not to pretend that there aren't folks doing that and have been doing it for decades. So much appreciation for that, and we could use some more of it. Yeah, thanks.
Well, now I'm all nervous. So I guess big dreaming for me is really an extension of what I feel I got to experience. The only reason I came home was because of two other dreamers. And I want to definitely acknowledge and honor Ed Fields and Mayor Randall Woodfin. They wanted to make sure that folk who had the skills and the talent that were from the space could come home to the space in a way that was equitable. And if it wasn't for the job and the salary that they gave me, I would have never come back here. And that is just, I moved to London at 18. I ran from here as far as possible. Ran. And so to make this place enticing is that's my dream. I want people to want to come home after they go to university. And I want them to walk hands in hand with the cousin that stayed in making change, right? Because not that they are to come and lead, but to come and walk hand in hand with the cousin who's still here, to share knowledge, to work together. I think we speak so much about the negative impacts of the criminal legal system on our communities, and we always leave out the economic violence. And for me, conscious raising across all racial lines in Alabama must include an understanding that for some reason, somebody's keeping us poor. And it's definitely not us. We crank out all the concrete everybody wants to use and half the pine. So who is keeping an economic boot on our neck that leads to a carceral reality? I would love to see that burden lifted. And so for those who are listening and they're imagining what can you do to support, I could have never found a job in Alabama to do this work. No university would hire me to teach this work. No, I had to create a job for myself. That alone is a privilege. It comes from a privilege of both work experience, travel, education. I want that to be collectively remedied, and not remedied only in the South. I want that to be something that the nation sees as their collective responsibility to give back to the place that fed you for 300 years. And do that in a way that is intentional, that centers those who are at the extreme margins, while making sure that those of us who are closer to the center put our bodies, our minds on the line first. So that's my dream, is an economic justice that will lead to power building, that will lead to us being able to actually sit with those elected officials. We're not there yet. We need people to come home, and that's important. And we also need people to be able to stay. So my dream is that we start to have babies that are born alive, that get to stay alive, and that we start to see a collective responsibility being expressed from the North and the West, not a accusation of moral failure, because that's not what's happening in the South. We are not morally corrupt and failed in that way. We are just a microcosm of what's going on everywhere else.
So powerful. Thank you, each and every single one of you, for the incredible work that you're doing. We have maybe time for one question from the Q&A and one answer to the question, and then I'm going to invite Avery to bring us back. But the question that I see right at top is, how do you hold yourself accountable to the communities you serve and who you collectively build with? If maybe one person wants to speak to that. And for the other questions that we couldn't get to, maybe we will be able to like answer those offline and get those answers to you. But for that first question, anyone have a burning answer to that? What does accountability to community look like in your work?
I would say accountability in my work looks like my community being able to question me, right? It's like we're having this conversation and they feel comfortable enough to ask me anything and everything that they want to ask me, and myself feeling comfortable to either answer or be honest and say, I don't know the answer. Right. And so that transparency and that authenticity allows for me to build those relationships and allow for me to be able to facilitate circles in a meaningful way, and then allow my community to be able to communicate back with me. That's how I feel as though I hold myself accountable, and also the circle keepers within Richmond Restorative Justice.
Beautiful. Maybe we do have time for one more person to also answer that question. It was very succinct, very good. Anyone else want to speak to that notion of accountability to community?
I could offer that the most critical thing for me is listening. Just if you can learn to listen to people, like really fully be in listening and hearing and figuring out, what your resources are to kind of meet a need and work with someone. I think that's where we're going to have that accountability that we're looking for.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, the R in restorative stands for relationship, right? Like the key to accountability is first having those relationships established. And I think you've all spoken so beautifully to how you are building those relationships, how you're maintaining those relationships to communities and to partners. So again, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. I'm gonna run through a few announcements from the National Center before we go, if I can have the screen shared again. So part of something that we want to highlight as a part of this webinar series, which we're calling Restorative Justice, a Regional Lens, is this project that we have worked on with the NACRJ, that's the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice, is this restorative justice map and directory of different restorative justice service providers and programs. We have a lot of wonderful people here who are on the map. But you can go to that map and see where people are doing this work all across the country. If you're doing work and you have a program, please submit that program. Or even if you are an individual practitioner who offers restorative justice services. Because while we have, again, awesome people here, I would love to see even more representation for the South and across the entire United States. So please go get yourself submitted and see the work that is already there. Next up, so I mentioned, again, the entire webinar series that we have is Restorative Justice, a Regional Lens. So the next one is going to be Restorative Justice in the North on June 26th. Then we have Restorative Justice in the Midwest on September 25th. And then we'll be wrapping up the series with Restorative Justice in the West on October 30th. But interspersed throughout there, we'll have other webinars such as Restorative Justice Storytelling, Restorative Justice and Neurodiversity and Mental Health in the Criminal Legal System, Restorative Justice Policy. So please make sure to go to ncorj.org/webinars to learn about those upcoming offerings and to watch past offerings. Yeah, a lot of great stuff there. And last but certainly not least, just a thank you to our panelists who have so graciously offered their contact info. So if you have questions, if you want to connect, as so many of our panelists spoke to, that importance of collaborating and connecting, that is really how we are going to make sure that this work lives and lives on. So please do reach out. I think that's it for my announcements. Thank you so much. Avery, anything else?
No, I'm over here contemplating my life. Like, do I need to stay in the North? I need to go back to the South. Is that home for me? I'm just doing all of the things. So thank you all so much for today. Thank you folks for tuning in. And there's much more to share. I know we couldn't get to all of the questions, but I see some folks trying to answer some. Hopefully I can hit you on the back end. Please don't forget to fill out the feedback form that we'll send you right after this, but also probably when we send out the recording. That's super helpful for us to know what to cover. A lot of these topics came from those feedback forms of what you would like to hear about. So just know we are listening and we're trying to do our best in that area. But thank you all again, panelists. This was super rich and excellent information. Thank you, Demointe, for moderating today. I really appreciate it. And folks, take care. We'll see you for the next one. Next month is restorative justice storytelling. So I'm excited about that and look out for information for that.